My name is Mara Doyle, and for 11 years I have kept drive coils running and hull plates seated true at the Kestrel yards. The drydock the Velinari Dominion lets humans work because none of their own people care to get grease under their nails. The ships up there are kilometers long, pale hulls lit gold and blue under the work lamps, and from the catwalks you can look down through an open service bay and see the whole curve of the homeworld turning underneath. And not one soul on that deck will ever ask your opinion on anything more important than a coolant gauge. Nobody at that dock knew my name. They knew my coveralls, my tool belt, the sound my boots made on the gantry decking. That was enough for them, and most days it was enough for me too. I'd come up through a war that ended before half the Velinari officers I worked under were born, and I'd learned a long time back that being underestimated has its own quiet uses. People leave you alone with your hands, and your hands learn things. I heard about the bird the way I heard about most palace business, secondhand, from Ren Okafor, who ran the dock's quartermaster's shed and had a cousin who scrubbed floors in the royal wing. Ren told it to me over cold tea one evening, half a joke at first. The little princess, he said, the youngest one, Sael, hadn't said 10 words to anyone in 2 months. She'd had a mechanical bird, a small bright thing the size of 2 fists, all brass and pale glass, that her mother had built for her before the old empress died. The bird sang in the empress's own recorded voice, told the girl when to sleep and when the morning bells would ring, kept her company the way only a parent who knew she was running out of time would think to do. Then the girl had dropped it, fleeing some cruelty from the older court children who'd always called her strange, and the bird had gone silent in her hands and never sung again. 12 Royal Engineers had been in to look at it. Ren counted them off on his fingers, like a man reciting a casualty list. Every clockwright in the capital, 2 off-world specialists, the Emperor's own chief artificer. All of them said the same thing in different words. The heart spring, the little driving mechanism at the bird's core, had shattered in the fall, and a shattered heart spring could not be remade, only replaced, and a replacement would not sing in the Empress's voice. The princess had refused a new bird outright. She wanted hers back, or nothing. I didn't think much of it beyond pity until I remembered my grandfather, who'd kept a shop full of old wind-up clocks and toy soldiers back on Earth, and had taught me, before I was old enough to understand why it mattered, that most things people call broken beyond saving have simply stopped being looked at properly. I went up to the palace gate on my own time, in my own coveralls, and asked the steward on duty if I might take a look at the bird. He looked at me the way you'd look at a stray dog that had wandered into a wedding, a drydock mechanic, handling a royal heirloom built by a dead empress. He didn't even send for anyone to confirm it. He told me to go back to my hull plates and leave royal mourning to people who understood what they were touching, and he shut the gate himself. I went back to my hull plates. 3 weeks later, the princess stopped eating altogether, and word came down through Ren's cousin that nothing the clockwrights had tried since had moved the bird so much as a feather's width, and that the chief artificer, out of options and out of pride, had finally mentioned, almost as an afterthought, almost as a joke, that there was a dock mechanic who'd once asked to see it. That was how court worked, I learned, not by anyone deciding I was worth listening to, by everyone else running out of better ideas first. They sent a proper escort this time, which felt like being arrested more than being invited. I was walked through halls with ceilings higher than any hangar I'd ever worked under, past pale-skinned courtiers who watched me the way Ren watches a leak he can't yet locate, until I was brought into a quiet room where a thin girl with silver-white hair and faintly glowing violet eyes sat on the edge of a bed far too large for her, holding a small dead bird in both hands, like it was the last warm thing in the world. Nobody introduced us. I don't think anyone in that room expected I'd need introducing. I sat down on the floor in front of her, because that put us at the same height, and asked if I could hold the bird. She didn't answer, but she held it out, and her hands shook doing it. It took me 20 minutes with a thin pick and a loop to find what 12 Royal Engineers in 2 months had missed, mostly because they'd been looking for something grand. They'd opened it from the top, hunting the heart spring, certain the failure had to match the size of the grief around it. Underneath the breastplate, the housing was scored with fine new scratches, a dozen sets of careful, expert fingers, all of them stopping at the same locked gear train and turning back. I opened it from underneath instead, the way my grandfather always did with a stuck movement, working by feel more than sight. and found 3 small drive gears that had walked clean off their track in the fall, jammed sideways against the housing, locking the whole mechanism before it ever reached the spring at all. The spring hadn't shattered. It had simply never had the chance to try. Whoever built that bird had built the spring to outlast a war. It was the cheap, ordinary little gears beneath it that had failed, the same way the cheapest part in any machine usually does. I worked the 3 gears back into their seats with the edge of my pick, slow, the way you'd reset a wrist joint, and when they sat true again, I did the only other thing the bird needed, which was nothing clever at all. I wound it. By hand, the small brass key still tucked under its wing, where it had always been, where I suppose 12 men too important to look for a key had simply assumed there wasn't one. For a moment nothing happened, and I thought I'd been wrong, and I felt the particular kind of foolish a person feels when they've promised a child something with their hands instead of their mouth. Then the bird's small glass eyes lit pale gold, and it lifted its head off my palm, and it sang 4 notes in a voice that wasn't mine, and wasn't the princess's, a voice that belonged to a woman neither of us had ever met, but that the girl across from me clearly knew the way, "You know your own name." She made a sound I won't try to describe and gathered the bird against her chest, and for a long moment the room was just her shaking shoulders and that small bright voice singing on, patient, the way it must have sung 100 mornings before any of this happened. The emperor came in partway through that, drawn by whatever passes for word traveling fast in a palace, and he didn't say anything either, not at first. He just stood in the doorway and watched his daughter hold something that sang again, and watched the woman sitting cross-legged on his floor in oil-stained coveralls who'd put it there, and something in his face did the work words usually do. He was a tall, pale man with the same faint violet at the edges of his eyes as his daughter, dressed for some council session he had clearly walked out of mid-sentence, and for a long moment he looked less like an emperor than like any tired father I'd ever seen standing in a doorway, afraid to step closer in case the good thing in front of him turned out to be a trick of the light. Afterward, in the corridor, the same steward who'd turned me away at the gate stood waiting, and for one long breath, I thought I was about to be walked straight back to the yards and told to forget the whole afternoon. He looked, if anything, more uncomfortable than he had the first time, a man working out how to apologize without using the word. Instead he asked, stiffly, like the words cost him something, whether I'd consider a standing post in the royal wing, keeping the bird, and whatever else needed a steady hand instead of a grand theory. I told him I'd think about it, mostly out of old habit, the habit of a woman used to being asked nothing and offered less. It is a hard thing to trust a door the moment after it opens, when you can still feel the shape of it shutting in your face 3 weeks before. But the princess found me before I reached the gate a second time, the bird perched warm on her shoulder, and she asked me, first words I'd heard her say all afternoon, whether I'd come back and wind it again sometime, in case it ever forgot how. I said I would, and I have, every few weeks since, sitting on that same floor with a girl who no longer flinches when the court children laugh, listening to a small mechanical bird sing in a dead woman's voice, doing the only thing I've ever really known how to do, which is notice the small true thing everyone grander than me walked straight past,